Yes, thank you very much. And we do have, really, it's a treat for somebody to joining us this evening. Christy Rome is the Executive Director of the Texas School Coalition, based in Austin, but it's an organization that represents, at the state level, all of the Robin Hood districts all across the state of Texas, or many of them. Christy is her reputation is of a fantastic school finance mind, and many people in the Capitol look to Christy for information and for guidance. And Christy, thank you for joining us tonight. Christy is going to talk to us about really the statewide economic outlook and what we might be looking forward to in the next few months as we enter legislative session season. So, Christy, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and see if I can get things rolling. All right, are you guys seeing my screen okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All right, excellent. Well, again, it's good to be able to join you, even if it is virtually. I'm always glad to be in and around this most excellent district. And I will say that in this position, I am often the bearer of bad news. And given the topic this evening, that trend continues. But I think it's important for us to work from a good set of facts, even if we don't like the picture that they paint. So we'll dive in, and just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about this evening, we'll look at sources of school funding and state revenue just to set the context, that economic outlook for our state, learn a little bit from history, see what that can teach us, and then take a look at the road ahead. So I'm sharing with you just kind of in general sources of school funding and state revenue, again, to set that context and to make sure that we're all understanding what all of these different economic indicators mean, because I'm going to throw a lot of information at you in this one slide, and it is okay if you can't read all of those labels, because the most important part for you to pay attention to are the two green pieces of the pie. And that's what share of general revenue expenditures for our state go towards public education. It's the lion's share of the state budget, 38%, more so than Health and Human Services, at least for now. We'll see what happens next session. But public education is the largest expenditure in our state. What that funds, as you see over on the total general operations funding for school districts statewide, is that now 46% of funding for public schools comes from that state share. Now, you probably are thinking, but not in GCISD, and you're correct. Because, as you well know, the vast majority of your budget comes from the local M&O property tax. You have a small portion of state funding in your district. What we need to be recognizing here, though, is that regardless of which of these two state and local share pies we look at, if the pie on the left becomes smaller, the pie on the right does as well. Because even for a district like GCISD that's relying heavily on local revenue to fund your schools, because of equalization in our state, they will cause that recapture to increase if they have to decrease the size of the pie for all schools. Just something to keep in mind. And we might be wondering, well, where does state revenue come from that funds that general revenue for schools? Primarily from the sales tax. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the sales tax, more so than these other sources of state revenue tonight. Obviously, an economic shutdown has had an impact on the sales tax. So as we look to this economic outlook, of course, we know we're going to see a lot of downward trends. You won't be surprised by this graph. I've tried to make the sales tax line a little bit bigger so that we can focus on that since it's our main source of revenue. But you can see from this graph of fiscal year 20 that we saw a significant dip during the economic shutdown in the spring, April, May. We saw things pick back up again in July as things were reopening. And now we've seen a bit of a downturn again in August, and that's kind of plateauing into September, which is not shown here. But we don't still see the same amount of growth that we did earlier, a little bit earlier. So I told you we'd look at state sales tax revenue. This is looking at all funds, so not just the general revenue, because general revenue funds do some wonky things when you have to put a large portion aside to the highway fund, for example. So this is just looking at what was collected. And the important takeaway here is that our current budget was built on the assumption that sales tax revenue was going to increase, that everything was going to be above that zero line. And in fact, it's been quite the opposite since the pandemic, the onset of that in March. So this 2.9 is our last really good month of that trend. That was March. Then we see April, May, June. Again, July picked back up, but then we see another dip again in August and September. So these are comparing what the sales tax revenue was in that month in fiscal year 2019 to what we saw in 2020. So this is not looking at month to month as far as, May to June. It's looking and comparing to where we were last year, and we again thought we would be doing better than last year, and in many cases we're doing worse. So what a difference a year makes, amen, not just for budget, but everything that you're working with in your school district as well. Very different from where we were in the summer of 2019 when the budget was certified and we believed that we would have a budget surplus of almost $3 billion. Healthy rainy day fund, the economic stabilization fund of $9.4 billion. There might be some additional money that was needed for Medicaid. That's always, another billion for Medicaid is not outside the norm. Then, of course, after the pandemic and the onset of that, in July of this year, Comptroller Hagar came back with a revised revenue estimate that said, well, instead of a surplus, we now have a $4.6 billion deficit. And we have less in the Economic Stabilization Fund because that's, of course, funded by the severance tax, so oil and gas, and that continued weak market. 8.8 is as good as we're going to get there. The good news, though, one little piece of good news is that we are not going to, we don't believe the state will have to appropriate additional funding to Medicaid because federal funds have kicked in to cover that. So this is just to give you the perspective of the starting point of our state budget in recent bienniums. And the more recent trend is that we've seen a surplus to begin the budget writing process. We already know we're going to have a deficit of $4.6 billion. I would not be surprised if we have a revised estimate again when we see that biennial revenue estimate that comes out in January, that $4.6 billion deficit is going to be greater than what was projected at this point in time. But even if it's just the 4.6, it's important to keep in mind that that's actually a $9.3 billion swing from where we were when we were building the budget at the beginning of the last legislative session. Again, the Economic Stabilization Fund, this is just to give you the context of that, the ups and downs, the deposits, the expenditures from that fund. I know there have been times in the past when we as public school districts have questioned, why are you keeping so much in that Economic Stabilization Fund when we have desperate needs with serving the students in our districts? I think now at this point, we're probably glad that it has the balance that it does as we're looking at potential cuts. Again, that $8.8 billion number is adjusted downward from where it once was. So the deficit of $4.6 billion, this is how we get there. Actually, what the comptroller said is that we have $11.6 billion less in state revenue, that slowing of tax collections. But this revised revenue estimate, knowing more than we once knew, also is able to recognize that we have $7 billion of previously unrecognized state savings, primarily from increased property values that are above where they thought they would once be. So put those two things together, and that's how you find yourself with the $4.6 billion shortfall. So you might be asking, what are the details of that savings of $7 billion? Well, they come primarily from the foundation school program. Now, I need to clarify here, it looks nice and neat and tidy, and unfortunately, most state budget numbers are not this neat and tidy. if you were to total up the 3.5, the 1.2, and the 2.3, you get $7 billion. It's not quite as neat and tidy as that. There are other state savings because there is some overlap here between the federal ESSER funding from the CARES Act and the reduction in state aid. So there's some overlap there. It's not quite as neat and tidy as just $7 billion. But regardless of that, a significant portion of the $7 billion in savings comes from a reduced amount of state funding going towards the foundation school program. And I will note that part of this $2.3 billion here in increased property tax collections that resulted in $700 million more in recapture than was originally projected when House Bill 3 passed. Speaking of House Bill 3, we know that there was a significant investment made in public education during the 2019 legislative session. $6.4 billion were invested into schools, $5.2 billion invested into reducing property taxes. And that $5.2 billion cost is going to balloon over time because the state has committed to buying down that property tax rate a little bit more each and every year. That's going to continue to increase in cost in an era of now cost containment. So there were questions when this bill passed about the sustainability of those investments long term, now even more so than before. Something else that House Bill 3 promised was a reduction in recapture. So this is just to give you a snapshot of the past 5 years. Are we really seeing a reduction from when this bill was adopted in 2019? The blue here represents recapture statewide. The red line is to show you that you're pretty much on the same trend line as the state in the amount of dollars that are paid out of Grapevine Colleyville ISD in recapture. Now, we don't, what's missing from this slide is a huge reduction in recapture, but I would submit to you that House Bill 3 was more of a preventative measure when it comes to recapture, that it prevented recapture from becoming as bad as it would have been absent of that legislative change. It doesn't really deliver actual recapture reduction compared to the previous years per se, but it does stunt the growth of recapture. We'll put it that way. So I think there's something to be learned from history. If we look back at the two previous recessions and the way the legislature responded, we might be able to glean some indication of what we can expect in this coming legislative cycle. The 2001 recession was caused following the September 11th attacks in 2001. So the 2003 legislature entered into the budget cycle with a shortfall, and here's how they addressed it. They had some general revenue cuts. They used some budget gimmicks, which we'll get into a little bit more in a bit. They had some federal funds, and they spent out of the rainy day fund. And those are pretty much the tactics that the legislature has with which to address a shortfall. So the Great Recession that was caused by the subprime mortgage lending crisis, the Great Recession in 2008, we didn't really feel the effects of that as quickly in Texas as they did elsewhere in the nation, partly because of our biennial legislative cycle. So in 2009, the U.S. Congress adopted a stimulus package, and the Texas legislature used that to fill some holes so that we didn't have the cuts in 2009. So when they convened in 2011, with the absence of additional federal funding, they had to dig deep and make some cuts. They had a huge shortfall when that session began. And as we all know, that did result in some cuts to public education funding. $6.4 billion was cut from public education funding, and that resulted in a $14.2 million cut to GCISD. So these are the ways, again, that when the legislature was faced with a shortfall, this is how they responded. We see some eerily familiar circumstances as we look to what we might see in 2021. First of all, it's on the heels of some major property tax compression legislation. We know that we're in a national and state economic recession. We've already seen some federal stimulus dollars for the CARES Act. There may be more federal stimulus dollars to come in 21. We'll ask me after November 3rd. I'll tell you my best guess then. We know that there's going to be a state budget shortfall, and we've already seen the same requests of state agencies to reduce their budgets by 5%. We may see calls for even greater reductions. The foundation school program is exempt from those calls for reductions at this time. So as we compare this to previous recessions, again, this is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. This is looking at state budgets, but on a national level, so this is not Texas specific, but I still think it gives you a pretty good overview and prediction of what some economic experts are predicting, that this recession may well be worse than the Great Recession, the Greater Recession, I don't know, that doesn't have a nice ring to it. Again, we might not see the full onset of how the effects of this recession and possibly until 2023. We don't know if the worst of it's going to hit us in 21 or if the worst of it's going to hit us in 23 just yet. Isn't that nice to know? We don't know which biennium is going to be worse. So it is an uncertain road ahead. As we look just at this current school year, we believe that the shortfall in the current biennium should be able to be managed without cuts during the current school year. But I just want to throw out there that it is still a possibility because the legislature will convene in January. They can adopt a supplemental appropriations bill. They will adopt a supplemental appropriations bill. We just don't know what will be in it. One thing that could be in it is a reduction of some form for school funding. We hope that's not the case and hope that's not necessary, but it's a possibility. State leaders have also begun to talk about the possibility of requiring districts to spend down their undesignated fund balance dollars to either avoid having to spend out of the Economic Stabilization Fund or perhaps coupled with that expenditure. And I want to just say that there is no authority from the state legislature to force a district to spend down fund balance. However, the state legislature does control what your funding entitlement is. And one thing that's been done in other states is that other states have reduced school districts' funding entitlements based on what they have in their undesignated fund balance. So just something for you all to keep in mind. Also, that schools have been given so far a hold harmless protection that will last the first semester, the first 18 weeks of the instructional year. And then also the local flexibility for remote instruction that lasts for the entire school year. We don't know exactly what's going to happen when that hold harmless runs out. And we have seen a 3 to 4% decline in enrollment statewide. And it's just a matter of, is the legislature going to allow districts to take that hit in the reduction of funding, or is that something that they will, again, help to make up for in an era when we have increased costs for serving kids? So tools in the fiscal toolbox. These are some tactics, gimmicks that legislators could employ. I want to caution you and say these are one-time measures, which means that you can only use them one time and then they're gone. Usually, when these have been used in the past, 1, 2, sometimes 3 sessions later, they will come back and restore these one-time measures so that they're available again for the next downturn. So all of these are kind of on the table right now. We've already talked about the $8.8 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund. They can delay the August payment for the Foundation School Program into the next biennium so that they can save $2 billion more immediately. Same thing with other delayed payments and transfers. I think it's a question, though, of do you employ all of these one-time measures in 21? Because then what if things do get worse and you come back in 23 and you have none of these tools available to you? Or will legislators use some of these measures, a combination of other reductions? Those are the tough decisions that they'll have to make. Because they look at the budget that they're going to have to write. I think that, again, that biennial revenue estimate that we will receive the day before the legislative session begins in January, I think it could paint a worse picture than the $4.6 billion shortfall we've been hearing about so far. If they were to adopt a current services budget that just maintains existing state spending and also supports the growing costs of public education and tax rate compression that they've already adopted into law, economic growth of 20% or greater would be required in order to meet that current services. The highest amount of economic growth on history in Texas was in recovering from the 2010-2011 recession and that was 20.9% growth. So that's definitely a stretch goal to think that we might be able to get there at this point in time. Even with the one-time tools, I would say that cuts are not completely off the table or unlikely. That's very much a possibility this session. Will they postpone further tax rate compression, or are they going to still add that to the increased cost column? We don't know at this point in time. And then again, I would submit to you that there's going to be a greater need for spending in health and human services. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and I don't know that by the time the legislature is finally adopting their budget in what I hope is May of 2021, I don't know that we're going to be completely through the pandemic by then. So the health and human services needs, the unemployment rates that have been record high, that drives up the need for human services and the need for spending in health and human. So public education is going to be competing with that very pressing need as well. So with all of that good news, I will stop talking, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Christy.
Do we have any questions? Becky.
Yeah, Christy, this is Becky St. John. With regard to the foundation school program, you weren't showing much reduction there. Can you explain that a little bit more? And what are you hearing, if anything, because there's going to be some seat changes out of the SBOE with regard to how they're handling their control of the investment?
For the permanent school fund.
Yes.
I have not heard that there will be much of a change. Obviously it's not going to be it's not performing to the degree that it has in the past. So I think that there will be potentially less of a transfer. The good news, though, is that we recently approved a constitutional amendment that allows for them to transfer a little bit more money from the available school fund than we've seen in the past. So hopefully that will help to make up the difference, at least this time around. Again, what's going to happen in 23 is a whole lot less certain.
Yeah, they could only go to that well so many times, I suppose. And then, so that actually was kind of a two-part question. So with regard to the foundation school program, you weren't showing a whole lot of change there. I'd have to go back to the slide. It was like 105, was it 105? But you weren't showing a lot of movement there. Can you touch on why that is? A lot of change there?
I'm not let's see. I bet
it's probably about halfway back.
Was it this one? Am I sharing again? No.
Not yet.
Is that it there?
Yes. Yep, the FSP.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is just from the revenue estimates from what's been adopted in the budget today. So,
okay. Yeah. This was actually the one. So what's your? I'm sorry, my question really wasn't. So my concern here is the piece on the local property taxes, which includes recapture, right? You're showing it going up about $2.3 billion, and that's all predicated on property values increasing. That's my question. And of course, for school districts like us, the piece that still comes into play there as well. The comptroller is still going to come out with his estimate. We couldn't get those numbers to drop even if we wanted to, because the appraisal district still has to hit the targets that the comptroller comes out with. Is that correct?
Yes. So property taxes are assessed based on where the values were January 1st. So that's why we have not seen changes in property values during this school year. And I think that we will likely see some change in the collections, because we have begun to see both citizens and businesses that are unable to pay the taxes based on unemployment and business closures and things of that nature. But we don't yet know exactly what the impact on property values is going to be in the next
right.
When we get to January 1st of 21, what those values will look like.
Right. Okay. All right.
Some areas of the state are holding their values even
Yeah.
during the recession. I imagine that the area that you all are in is probably one of those. Other areas have already seen a very steep decline, especially in our oil and gas districts.
Oh, wow. Wow. So I guess, yeah, be careful what you ask for. I guess stable is good when your home is your largest asset. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Do we have any other questions? Seeing none. Dr. Ryan?
Christy, thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, your knowledge about state budgeting and is just incredible. And we're certainly glad that you're able to represent the Texas School Coalition. And we appreciate all you do to help us during the session and in between. We'll be posting your presentation soon. And thank you again for joining us. I'm glad you don't have to get in your car and drive back to Austin at this point. It's been
well, thank you for having me.
You bet. Thank you, Christy.